Alright, so October's back again, and it always seems like it takes forever to get here, but also gets here really quickly at the same time. It's weird, but as the case with many people, it's probably my favorite time of year, especially being able to talk about stuff like this and just get full on into horror movies and stuff like that. But last year we did a lot of the original versus remake thing, and we are basically going to carry over and continue to do more of that. As you can see, we're starting with Romero's Night of the Living Dead from 1968, and then Tom Savini's Remake from 1990, represented here by this 4-pack that has the likes of zombie strippers in it. But before we go into that, I guess I should mention that this won't be the first time we're talking about Night of the Living Dead, because I did do a video like 5 or 6 years ago where I talked about a certain amount of the Dead lineup, where I think we talked about Night of the Living Dead, and then Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, and I think Land of the Dead is where we ended. That's as far as I wanted to go, because I was never really that big on the couple Romero ones after that. But obviously we have the start of not just that series itself, but the sort of zombie genre as we know it now, and that whole starting point, and talking about the idea of it being remade in 1990, which seems like maybe not the best idea, because there are so many aspects of the original movie that made it what it is, for being of its time and being super low budget and all that. So the idea of adding, you know, a color to it and a bigger budget to it, what is that going to do to it? And surprisingly, I've seen a sort of mixed reception on it, but I've always found it to be a rather positive. I have a rather positive outlook on it for the most part, and it was introduced to me by people that had a positive outlook on it. I have heard some negative feedback on it every now and then, but it's surprisingly not that often. I think everybody's just well aware that it's not the original movie, but for what it is, as far as being a remake of a movie that basically started a whole genre, it's surprisingly not bad, and does come from a place of love as far as Savini comes from. Not to mention the fact that Romero wrote the script for it. So that was probably a big factor also. But to talk about, you know, comparing them, I guess we just right away we can start with the opening scene, because there's nothing that feels more October and the fall season and Halloween season and all that than the opening scene of Night of the Living Dead. And it might seem like it takes away from it when Criterion put this Blu-ray out, and now it looks really, you know, crystal clear and crisp, but even with that, I feel like this, even though it doesn't have the sort of public domain, sort of filmy, grainy look, it still works just as well. And the thing about it is, it has an atmosphere going for it that it always had, but I think the great thing about it is that it seemed to embrace the atmosphere more than being cinematic, because like I was saying, I feel like the wide appeal of Night of the Living Dead is that it feels as real as possible because of how low the budget is. Where it feels like you basically just picked up somebody's, you know, old video camera and this is what was on it. So that idea of it feeling a bit more messy and less cinematic, yet also maintaining an atmosphere, is something really special about the feel of the movie that would be really hard to replicate. And just watching it from, like, you know, the opening dialogue, just watching Barbara and Johnny have this conversation, this sort of sibling bickering and him complaining that they have to come all the way out here for their father's grave, and then how quickly the movie picks up. But even then, there's just ominous tones about it. Like I don't know if it's the sound of the wind, or if it's like, sometimes it sounds like thunder and the way distance, despite the fact that there's never a storm in the movie. But like I said, there's just something so ominous about it, and when we see the first ghoul walking around, like, way in the background, and it just looks like another person, where it's something ominous, but you don't if you put yourself in the mindset of you don't know what's about to happen, it doesn't seem like there's anything threatening going on or anything looming, and it's about 30 seconds away from going off, and never coming back, which is amazing. And I love the sort of ominous foreshadowing also, like when Johnny's talking about their grandpa or their uncle or somebody. When they were kids, they were playing in this area, and he jumped out and scared Barbara, and this relative said, "You'll be damned to hell," to Johnny. And something that kind of seems to go overlooked is the fact that apparently when Johnny was a child, he was told by a relative, "You'll be damned to hell," in pretty much the place he ends up dying, which is in itself is just really ominous to me. And then obviously, like I said, everything kicks into gear very, very quickly. In like the first 30 seconds to a minute, it feels like. This guy walks up, seems like he's... The thing about it also is that they hadn't completely gone all out on makeup at this point. So this guy just looks like he could be an insane person who attacks Johnny and Barbara and chases her off. And like I said, immediately how it starts from there and then just pretty much never lets up from that point on, is the roller coaster of this movie is, and it gives you that vibe that a higher budget movie you would think would do, seems to do with ease, but this one just, like I said, 30 seconds and then it's just off, with barely a budget at all, and it can give you that roller coaster of an experience like anything else. As far as the remake trying to replicate this, like I said, there's just something about the low budget and the black and white that just really adds this ominous thing to it. When it comes to the opening of Night of the Living Dead, sometimes I'll just go back and watch it just to watch it by itself. Even though the whole movie is great, sometimes I just get an itch for that opening by itself. So the idea of would it have the same feel in color and with a slightly higher budget? And to be honest with you, sometimes I forget that we have the answer to that question. Because I get so swept up in it. But yes, we do have a color version with a bit of a higher budget, and written by Romero. But what's interesting about this one, and I could see it being controversial, but I can also see it being embraced. I'm one of the people that embraces it, and that is the idea of making the scene what we typically know it to be, and then tweaking it a little bit. We're giving us what we expect, and then giving us a little something else that we don't expect. So we have this moment at the beginning where we're getting all the dialogue out of the way. The dialogue is happening during the opening credits now, where it was just kind of in silence with ominous music in the original. So basically, as soon as Barbara and Johnny get to the cemetery in this one, it's ready to go down already, like just as the as the opening credits are ending. And it's also an added bonus that Johnny in this particular case is Bill Moseley, who's probably one of my favorite people to see pop up in any horror movie. He's just got that energy about him, even if it's a tiny, tiny part like this, or a part like, you know, Otis and the Devil's Rejects. He's gonna go 100% with everything, and any movie is better with just 10 seconds of Bill Moseley. So, but then, talking about the changes here, they do have that moment where we talked about the interesting thing about the first Ghoul in Night of the Living Dead is that he looks relatively human, for the most part. When you think about what you typically think a zombie looks like, the guy looks human. So here, we have somebody walk up, and you might watch this and think, oh, that one looks like really, really human. And of course, the twist is that that's because he is. And it's like, I also like not only that this guy is still human, but who he is also, where we have the hearse in the background of the scene the whole time is also something that's just ominous in this really great way. And then, yeah, the twist is that this guy is human, and that's a fake out for another zombie to come out and attack when we think the scene's been turned on its head just enough, then what we're expecting comes in when we've let our guard down. And that's the thing also, is when you get used to what the ghouls look like in the original movie and how they basically kind of look like normal people because the budget was lower, it kind of catches you by, even though Tom Savini directed it, still, when that's on your mind, it's also kind of surprising to see when a zombie shows up in full makeup to attack her in this scene, when we have this, you know, replication of the opening scene. And then just her running around the cemetery, and we've got, you know, like, the open casket that he clearly came out of. We've got when she sticks the flowers into him, and how we can identify this zombie for the rest of the movie because of that. Just little added details like that. And then talking about when she gets to the house, and obviously in the original movie tells us that there's going to be a corpse already in there, and then she's going to run into Ben, and then the movie's going to take off. The idea that she does run into a corpse in the remake when she gets to the house, but it's a live one, and then she has to deal with that. And I think there's even a couple, actually. And then that's when we get Tony Todd, and when the movie kind of becomes what we think it's going to be, but it still will have those tweaks along the way as it goes, which we will talk about. So, talking about, the pretty much no budget whatsoever versus kind of having a budget now and being in 1990 and having more, effects at your disposal. Yeah, I do think a big part of the impact of the original movie is that sort of lack of budget and how real it feels. And when we have these moments also where the fact that the production doesn't feel big plays a big part in the effectiveness of the way they sneak up on you. Like, there's the moment when the zombie that eventually gets stabbed in the head by Ben comes into the house, and it sneaks up on her so quietly. I love the fact that even the score pulls back a little bit, to almost like it's allowing the ghoul to sneak up on her. And then there's another thing that I like about, I don't know how intentional it is. Like, if it's just something the sound picked up, or if it's something Romero did intentionally, or what. There's so many special features on this, and so many books and stuff like that. I probably have all the answers that I want, but I like to just kind of see movies from my own perspective, and then maybe look at that stuff later. But the idea that you can hear crickets for most of the movie, like I said, I don't know if that's intentional or not, but I kind of love it because it does give us this. Actually, I love it for a couple of reasons. Because not only is it just that ambiance in general that puts us in this very real place, because, yeah, if you've ever been outside at night, the crickets don't shut the fuck up. Critics don't really either. But not only do I love that for it feeling like a real night, but the idea of it basically showing that nature kind of goes on. Where it's like this whole outbreak is happening and this whole catastrophic event and so many people are dying. But nature's just going about its merry way. Crickets are just still being crickets outside. And that's, like I said, I don't know if any of that's intentional, but that's the way I've always taken it, and I love that sort of addition to it. And yeah, and just in general, how the whole thing feels like a community kind of put it together. This whole sort of Pittsburgh community where you see like cast members are being like not just reused as crew, but sometimes as other characters. Like I think the daughter Karen in the basement is also the corpse in the house at the beginning. And just stuff like that, you can really feel the sort of intimate nature of this movie and its production. And I feel like that helps a lot, especially, and the idea that when you say it feels like an intimate production, that can be something that seems sort of positive and comforting. But the idea that, claustrophobia and cabin fever might also be setting in at the same time, and that's an intimacy in itself, but in a not-so-good way, in a not-so-comforting way. All of that is just working to make this movie the full experience. I feel like they use the production to their advantage. Like, they used it wisely, having a higher budget in this, to where it didn't feel like they were trying to go all out, and they were trying to say, oh, we can make it bigger, and the idea of bigger being better to some people, especially people with money, and people that, are in producers' chairs and stuff like that. It still feels like it used just enough budget to do something that felt different and had kind of a different feel to show what this movie might look like with an increased budget, but it doesn't feel like it goes overboard with that. Like, maybe there's a couple of additions that might feel a bit overkill, but for the most part, I think it works just fine as far as not sort of overblowing itself, which it could have easily done. And that's something that, like I said, even like producers especially could have gotten really caught up in saying, no, it has to be big. If the whole reason we're doing it is, a go big or go home thing. So I like the fact that it still feels relatively small while still feeling like a wider production. But I don't think it hurts the movie at all as far as what this particular movie is doing and the particular feel that this movie sets up by itself when you're not comparing it to the original movie. So, and talking also about the ambiance, there's also the way the news and the radio are used, which are, the thing about it is it goes away pretty quickly in the remake. Like, they have the TV, and then, obviously, because Cooper wants to fuck everything up, they don't have the TV for very long. They get just enough, but we don't really go into the information of it. Of what could possibly be happening. And I actually think that's for the better. Where with something like this, the mystery surrounding it is scary enough that we don't really need an explanation. But at the same time, it does feel like the explanations we're getting on the radio and on TV in the original movie are intentionally vague. Like, there's enough there to give a reason that this might be happening, but it's still just like the media kind of running in circles around itself, which feels very accurate, especially with something like this. And the idea of, I like how when you see in the newer movie, when they're reading the news, they're basically scoffing it off. Like, there's a very potent disbelief in the news when it comes to this. And I like the sort of downplayed nature of it in the original movie, where it's like, where they're saying what's going on, and then they're basically just saying, I can't believe, like, I'm trying to be professional, but I also can't believe I'm telling you this. But the dead is coming back, and they're eating the flesh of the living. And so I kind of like that nature to it also. But the thing also that I like about the prominence of the radio and the TV in the original movie is not about getting information, but that idea of there just still being some semblance of the outside world that we can see. Where it's like, kind of imagine it like when, you know, like when people are alone and they'll put on like a video or music or leave the TV on or something to kind of feel like there's just another presence, and it makes somebody maybe feel not as like alone. That's the vibe I kind of get when we have the radio and the TV going in the original movie, where it's like there's just a little, that's the last sliver of normalcy we have, is having the radio on or the TV on and seeing that there are people still out there sort of reacting to this. And it's, I said, I appreciate that more than the whole idea of getting any information out of it. Because I don't think getting information about what's potentially happening here is going to really add much of anything. Especially when we come to the conclusion that we come to. It just kind of seems unnecessary. Like I said, when you look at it from the other standpoint of just seeing that the outside world still has a sliver left, is why I still like the inclusion of the radio and the TV. It goes much longer before the power finally goes out and kills it. But that's the thing also, is it does feel like a bit of a hopelessness sets in when there's like, I feel like there's maybe 15 minutes left when the power goes out, and when we finally lose all of the outside voices from the radio and TV, and then that's when everything starts to close in. I feel like it's pretty perfectly timed. So I like the way it's utilized in that way, for sure. So as far as like the characters go, we do have two prominent characters here with Ben and Cooper at odds, and you'll see like discourse all over the place and a lot of discussions about, you know, who's right and like who was right at the end of everything, and the conclusion that potentially it's like the dire nature of it is not only does Ben get, you know, needlessly killed, but also the fact that Cooper might have been right, because the way Ben was able to survive for as long as he did, he finally boarded himself up in the basement. But I feel like that's just kind of a pointless argument that for some reason people get really stuck on about, you know, should they have done what Ben said or should they have done what Cooper said? Because, first of all, we have context as a viewer that the characters don't, especially if we've seen the movie many, many times. Like, we know that, you know, help is going to come the next morning. So that probably would have completely changed everybody's way of thinking throughout this. But for all the characters know, this is going to be forever. And this, whatever the decision they make now is going to be how they survive for the foreseeable future, rather than just one night. So, taking that into account, when you see, what I think actually works about these characters is the fact that even though Ben is sort of much more heroic and Cooper is like, you know, the cowardly douchebag that seems to be working against them after a while, seemingly just to be an aggressive contrarian that's going to get them all killed, when we're in the early parts here when they first meet, I feel like it's a pretty steady back and forth where, I feel like it's realistic that way too, where Ben will say something and have a plan, and will say like, you know, oh yeah, that seems like a smart plan, that should be the way to go. But then Cooper will counter that, and then it'll be like, well, he has a point too, that's also very possible. And it kind of goes back and forth for a long time of both of them making sense. It's just a matter of not knowing which plan is going to be the one that may or may not save them. And like I said, it does feel like it kind of gives the edge to Cooper when he's able to save himself by boarding himself up. But then again, you can look at the futility of it, given what happens. And the fact that it was inevitable for this entire group. So, like I said, that's always just kind of been a pointless argument to me, and the appeal to me has been just kind of watching the back and forth and watching the arguments and the debates go back and forth. Because, like I said, at the time they're arguing, most of the time they both make sense. But then, as we said, Cooper becomes much more of an antagonistic character and starts working against them. It's tenfold with when Tom Tolles plays him in the remake, where just right from the get-go they make Cooper this villain that's basically basically right away trying his hardest to be as petty as possible and to try to get everybody but himself and his family killed, despite the fact that he'll probably do all of the above in the process. Because when you look at the Cooper in the original movie, he's cowardly and he's bullheaded, but it's really late in the movie before he, tries to lock Ben outside or, pulls a gun on him. And it's like the way he wants to bark orders while also just being completely useless. He's one of those guys that you've met in real life and would act exactly like this in this situation if it were real. And he's just very frustrating in that sense. Like I said, in the remake, Cooper is basically dead. Like, he's super cowardly and he's super aggressive. He's super contrarian just for the sake of it. And it's like he's actively trying to get them killed the whole time. Which shows how they went so far into this that it ends up changing the ending, because to satisfy the audience, we had to get another outcome, which we'll talk about. But what I love about it also is, the performances in both of these movies are really strong, and you would think that wouldn't be the case for a movie as low budget and like community-based as the original movie. But those go a long way, especially with both actors here playing Cooper, where it's like, I like to think, I can't prove this, but I like to think both of them took inspiration from Lee J. Cobb as juror number 3 in 12 Angry Men, is the vibe I get from both versions of Cooper. And the way also he goes on in the remake about putting like emphasis on wanting to protect his daughter's life, and it's like I feel like that makes him even more cowardly and shady, because, like I said, because his pettiness is constant. In the original, we kind of get the vibe he's just being overprotective, and it's because of the situation that he's as frantic and bullheaded as he is. And it only gets malicious later. The constant maliciousness makes everything he says in regards to his motivation seem, no, you're probably just out for yourself, and everything else is manipulation. And like I said, giving him more of this antagonistic feel. And to counter that with both versions of Ben, which are very stoic, especially Tony Todd here pre-Candyman, like 2 years pre-Candyman. It's interesting to see Tony Todd in a horror movie playing like this actual heroic character, like this great sort of leader of a character that really takes charge and is trying to, and has all of the ideas the constructive ideas to keep them from coming in, and the idea of seeing his background and knowing where he got the information that he has and the knowledge that he has of how to keep them away through this story that he tells. In the original movie, it's this story where he tells about how he learned how they were afraid of fire, and how he could, like, when there was, the fire, he could still hear the guy screaming, and he became encircled. And that really chilling moment where he talks about he realized he was alone when the screaming stopped, where that was the really crucial moment. But to kind of put the clues together and realize that they're afraid of fire and to be able to use that. And we can see how he came from probably being this relatively normal guy to being essentially the hero of the movie, where he almost has action hero qualities at certain points. And Tony Todd, in a very similar way, where he talks about this diner that he was going to when all this sort of started breaking down, and he learned that to go for the head. Like I said, where in the original he learned about the fire, and this one he realized, destroy the brain, and then that'll work. And like I said, just kind of getting these little pieces of how to possibly, not even stop it, just fend it off is all we're doing here. We're not trying to stop anything from happening because it's impossible and futile. So there's that. But also bringing in the side character. Before the side characters, I guess we can talk about Barbara also, who had a drastic change between movies. Where in the original movie, it's this kind of interesting twist where she starts off like she's going to be the main protagonist, and we start with her, we get her whole background, we see her go through it, and then we get to this point where she's at the house, and then once it settles in, what's happened to Johnny and basically everything else, she basically goes catatonic for most of the rest of the movie. But while there is a very scary aspect to this, where she's talking about, like, she recounts the opening, and it's like when she's realizing these were her last moments with Johnny, and so, like, she's breaking down, like, every little thing that he said, and how, like, every detail of what he said about the candy and everything like that is now, like, devastating, and how those were their last moments together. And that kind of settling in, and then the guilt eventually setting in also, and that's and the idea of what we were talking about before about the 30 seconds before everything goes down. It's setting into her how different everything was from then to now and how quickly that changed. Like, just at the drop of a hat, it was everything before and everything after just feel like it feels like two different lifetimes, from what normal life was to what the last few hours have been. And so that's really scary in itself. And with that being super overwhelming, you can imagine Barbara's brain essentially caving in, and then she just goes catatonic. Um, Significantly different approach in the remake. You might say the remake, as far as it treats Barbara, was ahead of its time, in a way, because instead of Barbara kind of taking everything in and then going catatonic, she decides that she's going to fight back and essentially become a warrior, where she even has the line where she says, I don't plan on losing anything else, as she's, like, blowing the heads off of zombies. And that, Patricia Tallman, being the actress, I think actually does that. It could seem like it would be a bit forced, because it would be a bit obvious, because when I was talking about being ahead of its time, where the idea where instead of female heroes just kind of being female heroes, it's this idea now where it's like it's kind of trying to correct the idea that we have of the women being damsels in distress and stuff like that. And I can understand where that could feel, where it could very much just feel like it's sort of a blatant correction rather than Barbara naturally getting to that point. I don't know, but I feel like it works. And even when we get those badass moments, like when she's, like, walking among them and stuff like that, and how it's not just these superficial moments. It becomes the character, and that becomes steady throughout her whole arc. And I like the idea of her. Like I said, the thing though is that it makes sense from both angles. Like when you look at, Barbara just being overwhelmed by everything and overwhelmed by grief and guilt and stuff like that, and it just, rendering her useless. That makes sense in context, just as it makes sense in context that Barbara would have the opposite effect. Barbara would make her vengeful, it would make her want to go after them, and make her not want to lose anything else, make her more determined and ready to, defend herself and everything around her. And I feel like the transformation works just as well on that front. So, I said, I guess we were talking about the realism. I guess that's another thing where it's like this one seems really rooted in that. So it does feel more movie like, to go from, like, nerdy Barbara to warrior, than it would just, like, watching everything crumble, because that's obviously just what's going on here in general. It's just the entire, not just, like, the world around them, but their individual lives also are just crumbling. Even though we don't really know the characters, we can still just sort of get that vibe. Like the way Tom and Judy are handled in both movies, where in the remake we get much more of a background, where we get, like, where this was, like, Tom's family, the house that they're in, and there's these moments early on when we meet him where he has to sort through his pain, because these zombies at the beginning that were in the house and stuff like that, these were all his family, and he's still dealing with that, and it makes him much more of a sympathetic character. As far as Judy goes, um, what's the thing about it is that the Judy in the '68 version doesn't really do a whole lot. She has this great sort of emotional scene where she sort of adds this, core of realism, where we see her worries and her doubts and her fears about the situation, and that's where everybody else is kind of either gone catatonic or is being frantic. We have Judy in here as just kind of this calm center of, like, really coming to terms with what has happened and what does it mean for the people we knew out there, and are the people we love still even out there and stuff like that. And that's a strength in itself. As far as doing things physically, the Judy in the remake does do a lot of things physically. Like, she's, helping put boards up, and she's fending off zombies and stuff like that. Um, she is relentlessly annoying while she does it, because she's screaming most of the time. There's this unintentionally hilarious moment, or maybe not unintentionally, I don't know, but she's boarding up one of the windows as a zombie's trying to come through, and while she's boarding up this window, she's just screaming frantically. And it's like I think a more determined Judy, who's more about just boarding up that window, and then that's like the laser focus, would have maybe been more appealing than a screamy damsel in distress Judy while she's helping. It's a weird balance of what they did with the character here. But they also have the moment when like she recognizes like Mr. Magruder's his name, and we can see like the denial set in. Like I said, where Judy's mindset in both movies does give us an idea of something that might otherwise be missing here, as far as this emotional core and this, almost kind of existential core, where it's like, what happens to who we love, and what happens after this, and like where do we go now, while everybody else is just worried about, the action of fending them off and keeping us, from getting eaten. But that's another thing also, is talking about the gore and how it's used, where I talked about, obviously we have a bigger budget in the remake, so we're going to have more makeup, we're going to have more gore. And it's basically expected, especially when Tom Savini's the director. It's going to have, great effects and great makeup and great gore, and it does. But that's the thing, is it does get us to a point where we are kind of expecting it at this point. So when we see the moment when they blow up in the original movie, there is this, and obviously the truck explosion plays out a little differently in ways that I like also, where it's like, in the original movie, it does just seem very, very reckless, where Tom's just flinging that gas around, and that's how they end up getting killed. I like in this one where it's, in the original movie, them shooting the lock, it ends up being a solution, and I like the fact that it basically plays a part in their death in the remake. But, yeah, the idea of them blowing up and then getting eaten afterwards. And it does feel, and keeping in mind what I was saying about Judy kind of being this emotional core and having these doubts and fears and these real thoughts that we would have in this scenario also, when we have a second to think. And then we see them die in the explosion, and it's tragic. It's like, yeah, that's, but it's 1968. They're not going to show us too much, right? They can't get too graphic. I mean, not only is it 1968, but they're super, super low budget. I mean, what could we possibly see that's going to disturb us until the end of time, that's going to haunt us and put imagery in our brains in cement, that's just there forever? And yes, we have the scene where they're eating. And yes, it does look like extras just eating, chicken or some kind of meat or whatever, but how big those bones are, and seeing them like, eating the skin off the hand and stuff like that, and the intestine and all that, it's crazy. It's crazy they did this in 1968. Like, forget the low budget. It's crazy that they did this at the time that they did it. It's wild. I would have loved to have seen the initial reactions to the gore in this movie, because it's just so, even when you're watching it now, when you're used to gore and you're used to seeing elaborate effects, when you go back to an older movie, you kind of expect to get an older movie. So even when you go back now, it feels unexpected and shocking, how gruesome this scene is where Tom and Judy get eaten after they've blown up. And like I was saying, though, the added disturbing factor of these weren't just throwaway characters. We had just really gotten to know Judy especially, and she has these very relatable thoughts and these relatable fears. She has people that she loves, and then we're just watching her become meat and bones being eaten. And that's the point they make a lot, where in like the news and stuff, where they say, how they're not doing like don't do funeral arrangements, don't save bodies, they're just flesh now. And to actually see that really play out with Tom and Judy is just really, that scene still like rocks me to my core in the worst way, but the best way. And then we get, when we're getting sort of closer to the climax here, and we have the moment that the movie's been building up to where Karen, the child, is going to come back to life. And the way they shoot this scene in the original movie, so using that budget again, where they use like the shadows and the minimal makeup to where it's like, where it doesn't, I like the fact that it doesn't look like some zombie, decayed, gory child. It, it's, it's their child. Like when she's approaching her mother with the trowel and all she has is dark circles around her eyes. And you can see where it's like, this mother can't do anything about this. Like the only choice this mother has is to be killed by her child because she can't do it in return. And the way they sort of play up that angle, where it's kind of she dies in a different way in the remake, but her blood splashes against a trowel to kind of be that sort of reminder. Um, I don't know the point of that, but but it's a nice callback, I guess, if you didn't want to kill her with the trowel, but it was there, but I guess allude to it rather than just doing the scene again. But I guess that goes back into preferring to sort of tweak things rather than make the exact same movie. I guess does feel like it gives it a bit more of a point. Um, but yeah, the way this climax is shown and seeing like a child turn on parents in this way, where we see the daughter eating Cooper after he's died, and then the fact that she doesn't even eat the mother, she just does the stabbing, is something that obviously doesn't come up in later zombie movies that were kind of trying to do Night of the Living Dead and running with the concept for themselves, is that they're considered like murderers by the media, and it's like because that's kind of what they're doing, and then like the whole eating flesh thing just kind of comes after the fact, but the murder is actually the first thing that happens. Like that's what it seems to be their goal at first. So the fact that she does like just murder her mother and then leaves it at that kind of highlights that concept a little more, and the concept that didn't quite carry over when other people started making movies with this concept. Um, but that, and obviously talking about family and confronting family and not being able to fight back. What ends up being Barbara's end in the original movie, where Johnny comes back, which is this wild callback to the most famous moment in the movie, where Johnny jokingly says, "They're coming to get you, Barbara," and the fact that he's the one that eventually comes to get her is so sick and twisted in in the best way possible. But like I said, totally different case with the Barbara here and the whole climax here. Um, because we do obviously, when I was talking about Cooper and how we kind of switched things up a little bit to make the climax more satisfying for the audience, because when you look at obviously when you look at the history of Night of the Living Dead, the thing that will always come up is how it sort of reflected the events that were happening in real life as it was coming out, and like these big historical moments where people were being killed, whether it be like Martin Luther King or Fred Hampton or whoever, the Manson murders eventually. It's like every time this movie got like a major release, something like that was going on. Or Robert Kennedy being killed, and it's like, and there was always a way to relate it to. It became this sort of Rorschach test of like every time it came out, it was basically reflecting the emotions of what was going on in history at the time. And that comes about because of the scene where Ben is needlessly killed, and and it's like where everything has been. It's an ending that we've obviously seen so many times over, but will never have quite the impact that it did this first time, where Ben is the sole survivor, and then just gets mistaken for one of them and is killed immediately, and then the movie just stops. And just it almost shows the futility of. You could say it's the futility of fighting back. You could say it's the futility of life. Anything, and you can say those reflections of historical events, and that is more intellectually stimulating for sure than what the ending of the remake is. But like I said, if you want to go for satisfying the audience and giving them this sort of payoff, it's interesting they go this route where Ben still is killed, but it's after he's turned. Which kind of gives him a bit more dignity in death, I guess you could say. But then we go out and we have, obviously with the ending of the original movie, we also have these moments of these still images that it goes into, and it's like the way, and keeping up with that real feel, where it does feel like when you look at like those old books that have like real crime scene pictures and stuff like that, or when you see, pictures of just death in general from the past, stuff that you wouldn't imagine they put in books now, but those books do exist, and that's what it looks like those are pictures of, are pictures from like some crime book or some, book of death or something. That's just really, really chilling, and just like the soullessness of having to burn the body. Necessary, but also an emotionlessness of just kind of piling the bodies and burning them, and knowing that the person they just threw on there is somebody who was alive and who had just survived, is so incredibly bleak. So it's like they kind of wanted to pick the audience up a little bit. There's still commentary in the remake, but it's very, very blatant. Like her literally saying the line, "They're them," and like "We're them and they're us." As we're watching the slaughter, and it's like if they just taken out that line, I feel like the ending of the remake would be a lot more powerful. I just really don't like how they spelled it out with that line, but it is still a really wild and disturbing finish to the remake where we're watching this. But then again, we do get the satisfaction of Cooper being the one that ultimately survived, and then she gets to kill him. And so that's definitely much more crowd friendly, and like I said, much more of a sort of traditional payoff. And because Tom Tolles played the character so well, and because they made Cooper so hateable, yes, I'm not complaining. It is a very satisfying ending, a very satisfying moment. Like I said, it may not be as intellectually stimulating as the ending of the original, and not as, of a historical significance and context of the original. And that's why, why this movie lives on, why it, has this Criterion release, why it's seen as, historically significant in movie history. And the remake is a good time, and it's obviously not going to reach the level of the original by any means. I don't even think that was ever the point. But it was just to kind of like modernize it and see how it works with its concept. Now that zombies have been a concept for quite some time, and seeing if this commentary was still there and putting it in the 1990 context rather than the late 60s context. There's still something worthwhile in the remake, but I mean, the original obviously can't be touched. I don't think anybody's going to really tell you otherwise. So I think that's going to be it for this one. So the next thing we're going to talk about... Actually, we have a movie club tomorrow for Horror Express with Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing and Telly Savalas. And then I think we're going to talk about... I'm going to talk about a miniseries, Stephen King miniseries, and then we're going to come back to another... original versus remake versus, and then we'll go on from there. And next week we've got something really fun happening. Hopefully you agree with that. So that's what we've got going on in October so far. So until then, I think that's it.